The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under the door of Unit 12B while Rebecca Torres was changing Mia's feeding tube and Maya was having another seizure. The paper felt heavier than it should, official letterhead announcing that 72 hours remained before the sheriff would arrive to remove their belongings and escort them from premises they could no longer afford to occupy. Rebecca read it once, twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with the other notices she couldn't address. Medical bills from Children's Hospital totaling $347,000. Collection agency letters threatening legal action. Insurance denial forms explaining why experimental treatments for Rett syndrome didn't qualify for coverage under standard policies. The paperwork of a life disintegrating in slow motion and documented with bureaucratic precision. Mia, 6 years old, sat in her adaptive chair by the window, hands moving in the repetitive ringing motion that characterized her condition. She couldn't speak, couldn't walk without assistance, couldn't feed herself or control the seizures that arrived without warning. But her eyes tracked movement, held intelligence that couldn't find expression through a body that refused to cooperate with her intentions. Maya lay on the couch, recovering from the seizure that had struck 20 minutes earlier, breathing steadied now, color returning to her face. Identical twins, both diagnosed at 18 months when the developmental regression began. Skills they'd been acquiring, words, gestures, purposeful hand movements, vanishing like morning mist. Replaced by the characteristic features of Rett syndrome that would define and limit their lives. The apartment carried the particular emptiness of a place stripped to essentials. No decorations, no excess furniture, nothing that couldn't be sold when the next medical crisis demanded funds that insurance wouldn't cover. The walls bore marks where family photographs had hung before Rebecca pawned the frames. The television space held only dust outline, sold 3 months earlier during Maya's hospitalization for pneumonia. Rebecca's phone, prepaid minutes running low, showed $183 in her checking account. Rent demanded $1,200. Utilities added $340. The specialized formula both girls required cost $180 weekly. Medications, even generic versions, consumed another $220 monthly. Her part-time work as a medical transcriptionist, on the only employment compatible with the girl's needs, brought in $1,680 before taxes. The mathematics allowed no ambiguity. This situation could not continue. She had been a research scientist once, the kind of neuroscientist that universities recruited with promises of laboratory space and grant funding. Her dissertation on neuroplasticity in developmental disorders had been published in Nature Neuroscience. Stanford had offered a postdoc position. The future had stretched ahead, filled with discovery and contribution and the satisfaction of work that mattered. Then the twins were born, beautiful and perfect, developing normally until the regression began. Her husband, David, unable to cope with daughters who required constant care and offered no conventional feedback, had left when the diagnosis was confirmed. In the divorce papers arrived with a note explaining that he needed to find himself, as though self-discovery required abandoning children whose only crime was having different neural wiring than society expected. Stanford withdrew the postdoc offer after she explained the situation. Research required presence, focus, the ability to work extended hours when experiments demanded it. Mothering children with profound special needs required the same things, leaving no capacity for both. The choice hadn't felt like a choice at all. Her daughters needed her. Science would survive without her contributions. That had been 4 years ago. 4 years of watching opportunities collapse, savings evaporate, hope diminished to the simple daily goal of keeping her daughters alive and as comfortable as possible. And the specialized equipment they required, adaptive chairs, feeding pumps, seizure monitors, communication devices that tracked eye movements, cost more than most families spent on vehicles. Insurance covered portions, but the co-pays and uncovered expenses accumulated like compound interest. Maya stirred, eyes opening. the confusion that followed seizures gradually clearing. "Mama?" The word came slurred but recognizable, one of perhaps 20 she could still access when her body cooperated. "I'm here, baby. You're okay. Rest now." The letter from Dalton and Associates arrived in the afternoon mail, wedged between a credit card offer for people whose credit hadn't already collapsed, and a reminder about the twins' upcoming neurology appointment. The envelope felt different, heavier stock than bill collectors used. The embossed letterhead suggesting expense beyond Rebecca's reach. Inside, language maintained the careful distance of legal prose, words chosen to convey information while disclaiming any emotional stake in their content. During the digitization of early 21st century property and asset records from closed biotechnology companies, an unclaimed facility deed had been identified. The document concerned a research laboratory and associated equipment registered under the name of Dr. Elena Torres, deceased 2019. According to current law, as the sole verified descendant and executor of Dr. Torres's estate, Rebecca Torres was being notified of the facility's existence and her legal right to claim any remaining assets pending inspection and verification of their condition and value. Rebecca read the letter 3 times. Convinced some crucial detail had escaped her attention. A laboratory, her grandmother, Elena Torres. The combination felt unreal, assembled from elements that didn't belong in the same sentence. Family stories about Elena had been sparse to the point of deliberate, reduced to adjectives that suggested judgment rather than affection. Brilliant woman, obsessive, lived for her work, died alone. No one had spoken of property ownership or facilities or assets worth claiming. The explanation unfolded across a second page. Elena Torres had been principal investigator at Neurogenesis Solutions, a biotechnology startup focused on neural regeneration research. The company had folded in 2019 following FDA rejections of their primary drug candidate and the departure of venture capital funding. Asset liquidation had been complex, with some properties sold, others abandoned, and several facilities essentially forgotten during bankruptcy proceedings that stretched across multiple jurisdictions. This particular laboratory, located in an industrial park outside San Jose, had been registered under Elena's personal name rather than corporate ownership, a quirk of early financing arrangements that meant it hadn't been included in bankruptcy asset sales. Property taxes had been paid automatically through an account Elena had established before her death, maintaining the facility in a legal limbo where it existed but nobody claimed authority over it. Recent consolidation of county property records had flagged the discrepancy. The laboratory remained legally registered to a deceased owner with one living heir. Rebecca could claim it, and though the letter carefully noted that decades of abandonment likely meant any equipment or materials inside would be worthless or hazardous. Rebecca felt something sharp and bitter rise in her chest. Her grandmother had been a neuroscientist, too, had published groundbreaking work on neural development before transitioning to private industry research that family couldn't discuss because confidentiality agreements survived death. They'd met only twice that Rebecca could remember, awkward encounters where Elena had seemed uncomfortable around children, uncertain how to communicate with someone who didn't speak the language of peer-reviewed research and protein synthesis pathways. The last time had been at her mother's funeral, Rebecca 14 years old and raw with grief. Elena had attended the service, sat in the back, and left without speaking to anyone. She died 5 years later, alone in a hospital after a stroke, and Rebecca had been too consumed with early motherhood and graduate studies to attend the memorial service or think much about a grandmother who'd never seemed interested in family connections. Mia made a sound, the particular vocalization that meant discomfort or need or simply the frustration of having thoughts that couldn't be expressed. Rebecca moved to her daughter, checked the feeding tube, adjusted the chair position, provided the comfort that required no words, because their communication had evolved beyond conventional language. That evening, after both girls were settled for the night, Mia in her adaptive bed with seizure monitors attached, Maya sleeping with the weighted blanket that sometimes reduced the frequency of her repetitive movements, Rebecca researched what she could about neurogenesis solutions and her grandmother's work. The company had existed from 2012 to 2019, focused on developing treatments for neurodevelopmental disorders. Their primary drug candidate, NG7, had shown promise in early trials for improving neuroplasticity in patients with conditions like Rett syndrome, autism, cerebral palsy. Phase 2 trials had been successful enough that venture capital flooded in, valuing the company at $800 million at its peak. Then Phase 3 trials revealed side effects. Nothing catastrophic, but concerning enough that FDA approval seemed unlikely without extensive additional research. Investors panicked, withdrew funding, when the company collapsed with the speed that characterized biotechnology failures. Equipment was sold, intellectual property licensed to larger pharmaceutical companies, facilities vacated. Elena Torres had been forced into retirement at 73, her life's work dissolved into bankruptcy proceedings and recriminations about unrealistic timelines and oversold promises. She died 18 months later, officially from stroke complications, but Rebecca suspected the actual cause had been closer to heartbreak and the loss of purpose that came from watching decades of research end in failure. The address in the letter led to an industrial park that Google Maps showed as partially abandoned, surrounded by tech campuses and commercial developments that had absorbed the area's prosperity while leaving pockets of obsolescence behind. So the building itself looked unremarkable in satellite images, single-story concrete structure with loading docks and minimal windows, the kind of anonymous facility that could house anything from data storage to light manufacturing. Rebecca called the attorney's office the next morning, using precious cell phone minutes to navigate automated menus before reaching a paralegal who sounded bored by the routine nature of processing inheritance notifications. "Ms. Torres, yes, we have your file. The facility inspection can be arranged at your convenience. I should warn you that it's been sealed since 2019. There's likely significant deterioration of any materials inside. Environmental hazard assessment would be advisable before full access." What kind of hazards? Biotechnology laboratory equipment often contains chemical reagents, biological materials, pressurized systems. 5 years of neglect could make any of those dangerous. Insurance won't cover entry without proper safety protocols. I understand. Can I schedule an inspection for this Saturday? The paralegal made notes, the sound of typing carrying through the connection. Saturday works. I'll arrange for a hazardous materials assessor to meet you there. Initial inspection will determine whether full access is safe. If the facility contains anything of value, further evaluation can proceed. If it's essentially worthless, you can sign documentation disclaiming ownership and the county will handle demolition. Thank you. After disconnecting, Rebecca sat with the phone in her hands, thinking about her grandmother working in that laboratory. She focused on neural regeneration while her own family relationships atrophied from neglect. Elena had been trying to solve the same problems Rebecca now faced with her daughters: how to help brains that developed differently, how to provide pathways for neural signals that got lost or scrambled in conditions like Rett syndrome. The irony felt almost cruel. Her grandmother had spent decades researching treatments for conditions exactly like what affected the twins, but had died before completing work that might have helped them. Now Rebecca was being offered access to whatever remained of that research, probably nothing but obsolete equipment and degraded materials, but she had to look. Had to see what Elena had left behind, even if only to close that chapter definitively. She told the twins about the trip during dinner, pureed nutrition for them, ramen for herself because their formula consumed most of the food budget. Maya's eyes tracked her face, comprehension present even if verbal response was impossible. Mia smiled. the expression sometimes appearing regardless of context, but Rebecca chose to interpret it as approval. "We're going to see something Grandma Elena built, a laboratory where she worked on helping people like you. I don't know what we'll find, but we're going to look together." The drive to San Jose took 3 hours in Rebecca's 2009 Honda Civic, the kind of vehicle held together by hope and routine maintenance postponed until absolute necessity. She'd packed emergency supplies for the twins, medications, formula, seizure protocols, portable suction in case of aspiration, and the medical arsenal that accompanied them everywhere. Both girls tolerated the drive better than expected. Maya watched the landscape with the intense focus she brought to visual stimuli, hands moving in patterns Rebecca had learned to read as contentment. Mia vocalized occasionally, sounds that might have been words if her motor control had cooperated, but Rebecca understood them anyway through the translation skills mothers developed when conventional communication failed. The industrial park materialized out of sprawl that characterized Silicon Valley's margins, where prosperity transitioned to obsolescence in the space of a few blocks. Active businesses occupied some buildings, their parking lots full of vehicles, their signage current. Others stood empty, for lease signs faded by sun, windows dark. Building 847 sat at the development's edge, separated from neighbors by empty lots where construction had been planned but never executed. The structure looked exactly as the satellite images had suggested: single-story concrete, minimal windows, loading dock with rusted doors. But something about it suggested it had been built with care, with intention beyond simple utility. A county vehicle waited in the parking lot, a hazmat assessor named James Chen emerging with equipment and a clipboard that suggested he'd conducted hundreds of similar inspections. His expression combined professional skepticism with sympathy that suggested he'd dealt with families discovering deceased relatives' abandoned projects before. "Ms. Torres, I'm James. Let me be direct about what we're likely to find inside. 5 years of neglect in a sealed facility means potential mold, degraded materials, possibly hazardous chemicals that have become unstable. We'll do a preliminary assessment with air quality monitoring before any extended entry. If it's unsafe, we evacuate immediately and recommend professional remediation or demolition." "I understand." The twins stayed in the car, parked in shade with windows cracked, seizure monitors active on Rebecca's phone. James noted their presence, his expression shifting to something that looked like recognition. "Your daughters have special needs?" "Rett syndrome, both of them." His face showed surprise, then something deeper. "Your grandmother was working on Rett syndrome treatments. That's what neurogenesis was developing before they folded." Rebecca felt something tighten in her chest. "You knew about the company?" "Everyone in Bay Area biotech knew about NG7. It was supposed to be revolutionary. When the trials failed, a lot of people were devastated. Dr. Torres especially. She took it personally." The building's entrance required 2 keys, both provided by the attorney's office. The lock resisted, corroded by years of disuse, but finally yielded. The door opened inward on hinges someone had maintained, despite the facility's abandonment. And Rebecca understood immediately that her grandmother had been here, had kept this place functional even as everything else collapsed. Inside, air quality monitors showed acceptable levels. No methane, no volatile chemicals, oxygen normal. James looked surprised. "That's unusual. Sealed buildings typically show significant degradation. Let's proceed carefully anyway." The facility revealed itself in stages. First, a reception area, dusty but organized, with furniture covered by sheets and a desk whose surface held nothing but a thin layer of particles. Then a hallway lined with doors, each labeled with clinical precision: storage, equipment, analysis, culture room, office. Rebecca opened the office door and felt time compress. Her grandmother's space, preserved like a museum exhibit. Photographs on the walls showed Elena at various career stages: young postdoc receiving an award, middle-aged principal investigator with her laboratory team, older scientist presenting at a conference. In each image, the expression remained consistent, focused, intense, devoted to work that mattered more than comfort or conventional success. The desk held notebooks, and their pages filled with handwriting Rebecca recognized from the few letters Elena had sent over the years. Research notes, experimental protocols, observations about neural development pathways. The most recent entries were dated March 2019, 2 months before Elena's stroke. Maya and Mia both showed improvement on the modified NG7 protocol. Hand stereotypies reduced by 40%. Eye contact increased. No adverse events. FDA concerns about hepatotoxicity seem manageable with proper monitoring. Why can't they see this works? Why does perfect safety profile matter more than giving these children a chance at better lives? The frustration bled through clinical language, revealing emotion that Elena had apparently reserved for private documentation. Rebecca read entry after entry describing research that had progressed farther than public records suggested, modifications to the original drug compound that might have addressed FDA concerns, small trials on patients whose desperation had exceeded their caution. Nothing illegal, but everything operating in the gray areas where determined scientists and desperate families met without formal oversight. Elena had been trying to help after the official pathways closed, working alone in this facility while the world forgot about her and her research. James appeared in the doorway. "You need to see the main laboratory. Now." The lab space occupied the building's entire central section, a room that had clearly been designed by someone who understood exactly what research required. Benches lined the walls, equipment carefully covered, storage systems organized with the precision of someone who valued time too much to waste it searching for materials. But the centerpiece dominated everything else. At the room's center stood a massive system of interconnected computers, servers, and specialized equipment that Rebecca recognized from her own graduate research. A neural simulation platform, the kind used to model brain development and test pharmaceutical interventions virtually before conducting actual trials. This system looked far more sophisticated than anything she'd seen in academic settings. Custom-built, probably costing millions, configured specifically for modeling Rett syndrome pathology and testing potential treatments. Screens stood dark, power disconnected, but the hardware appeared intact, as protected by climate control systems that had somehow continued functioning despite the facility's abandonment. James walked the perimeter, examining connections, checking for damage. "This is extraordinary. I've never seen this level of equipment in a private facility. Your grandmother built something remarkable here." Rebecca approached the central console, recognizing her grandmother's organizational style in how everything was labeled, how power systems were clearly marked, how safety protocols were posted at every station. Elena had worked here alone or nearly so, but had maintained every standard as though teams of researchers might arrive at any moment. A locked cabinet beside the main computer system caught her attention. Heavy-duty security, biometric scanner that would no longer function, but with a mechanical backup lock that looked functional. She tried the keys from the attorney's office. None fit. "Need to find another key," she muttered, searching the office, checking drawers and cabinets, finding nothing. Then she noticed the photograph on Elena's desk. Younger version of her grandmother holding a little girl, Rebecca herself, maybe 4 years old. One of the only times they'd met, captured in a moment before Rebecca's mother and grandmother had their final argument about priorities and family obligations. Behind the photograph's frame, tucked into the backing, Rebecca found a small key, the kind used for security cabinets, deliberately hidden where only someone who knew Elena's sentimental attachment to that image would think to look. The cabinet opened smoothly. Inside, Protected by desiccant packs and careful storage, sat the archive of Elena's final work. USB drives labeled by date and experiment. Notebooks detailing modifications to NG7 that had never been published. And in the back, a leather-bound journal with a note attached to the cover. For Rebecca, if she ever comes looking. Her hands shook opening the journal. Elena's handwriting filled the first page, dated 1 week before her stroke. Granddaughter, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've found this facility. I'm sorry I wasn't part of your life the way I should have been. I told myself the research mattered more, that saving thousands of children justified sacrificing relationships with the few I could have known personally. That was cowardice disguised as dedication. Everything in this laboratory represents 40 years of work on neural development disorders. The equipment, the data, the modifications to NG7 that I couldn't publish because FDA rejection meant no journal would risk their reputation on my work. But the real treasure isn't the equipment or even the research. It's what's underneath. When neurogenesis collapsed, I liquidated my personal assets to continue working. Sold my house, my retirement accounts, everything. I moved into an apartment and spent every dollar on this research because I couldn't accept that thousands of children would suffer while I had the capability to help them. The company's bankruptcy proceedings overlooked certain assets because they were registered in my name rather than corporate accounts. Specifically, the brain vault beneath this laboratory. The Neurogenesis's investors had allocated $850,000 for secure storage of sensitive research materials, biological samples, proprietary compounds, unpublished data. I built the vault larger than needed, and I built it well. What's stored there represents everything I couldn't finish, couldn't publish, couldn't share through conventional channels because the system values risk mitigation over human benefit. The vault access is in the floor panel beneath the central server station. The combination is your birthday, June 14th, 87. Everything inside belongs to you now. The intellectual property, the compounds, the data, and the monetary value of work that the world decided wasn't worth pursuing. Use it to help your daughters. Use it to finish what I started. Use it to prove that some research matters more than approval from people who've never watched a child struggle to communicate through a body that won't cooperate. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. I'm sorry I prioritized work over family. But maybe, if this helps you save Mia and Maya, the work will have justified the sacrifice after all. Grandma Elena Rebecca read the letter twice, tears blurring the words, before understanding fully crystallized. Her grandmother had known about the twins, had somehow tracked Rebecca's life despite the distance, had learned about her granddaughter's diagnosis, and had spent her final years trying to complete research that might help them. James was examining the floor panel Elena had mentioned, finding the seams hidden by careful construction. There's definitely a space underneath. A significant size based on how the foundation sits. Want me to proceed? Rebecca nodded, unable to speak past the emotion lodging in her throat. The floor panel lifted with mechanical assistance, revealing stairs descending into darkness. Emergency lights activated automatically, solar-powered backups that Elena had installed against the possibility of power failure. The stairs led down 20 feet to a reinforced door with a combination lock. June 14th, 87. Rebecca's birthday. The lock clicked open. The vault beyond was extraordinary. Climate-controlled space, larger than the laboratory above, filled with systems designed to preserve sensitive materials indefinitely. Freezers lined one wall, their contents carefully cataloged. Storage racks held compounds and reagents organized with pharmaceutical precision. And in the center, a fireproof safe whose door stood open, as though Elena had wanted to make this part easy. Inside, Rebecca found what her grandmother had preserved beyond her death. Research documentation, 5 years of work continuing after neurogenesis folded. Modifications to NG7 addressing every FDA concern. Trial data from patients, all carefully consented, all properly documented, all showing improvements that hadn't been possible with the original compound. Work that could restart clinical trials, that could lead to approval, that represented a viable path to treatment for Rett syndrome. And beneath the documentation, bearer bonds, physical certificates from an era when wealth could be held in paper form, each one stamped with denominations that made Rebecca's hands shake. $10 million, $25 million, $50 million. Bonds purchased with the proceeds from Elena's asset liquidation, stored physically because electronic accounts could be traced and claimed by bankruptcy proceedings. James, standing behind her, made a sound between awe and disbelief. $671 million in bearer bonds. Your grandmother converted her entire fortune into physical assets that existed outside the corporate structure. She was protecting her life's work from being dissolved in bankruptcy proceedings. Rebecca couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she was seeing. Her grandmother, who she'd thought had died alone and poor, who supposedly lost everything in the company collapse, had actually preserved $671 million specifically to ensure her research could continue. The bonds could be redeemed, the research could be completed, clinical trials could be funded privately, bypassing the venture capital cycles that prioritized profit over patient benefit. Her daughters could receive treatment. Thousands of other children with Rett syndrome could benefit from work that the conventional system had abandoned. Ms. Torres? James's voice came gentle. You need to sit down. This is a lot to process. She found a chair, sat heavily, looked up at the ceiling of the vault her grandmother had built. Elena Torres had chosen work over family, had died apparently alone, had seemed to represent everything Rebecca had promised herself she wouldn't become, so consumed by research that human relationships atrophied from neglect. But the vault told a different story. Elena had sacrificed everything, including her reputation and relationships, specifically to preserve the possibility that her granddaughters might receive treatment. She'd known about the twins. She'd structured everything to reach Rebecca precisely when it would matter most, when eviction threatened, when hope had dimmed, when a single mother with two daughters suffering from Rett syndrome needed exactly what this vault contained: research, money, and redemption. 3 gifts from a grandmother who'd shown love in the only language she spoke fluently. Dedication to work that might help children she'd never met live better lives than their condition typically allowed. Rebecca's phone buzzed, the twins' seizure monitor alerting her that Maya was showing signs of another episode. She stood quickly, moving toward the stairs with the automatic response of a mother whose children's needs overrode everything else. But she would return. With her daughters, with the proper resources, with the beginning of understanding that some inheritances were measured not in comfort or conventional success, but in the fierce determination to give future generations what the present couldn't provide. Elena Torres had been a difficult woman, obsessive, terrible at relationships, unable to balance work and family in ways society demanded. But she'd also been brilliant, determined, and willing to sacrifice everything, including her own reputation and peace, to preserve the possibility that her research might help her granddaughters survive and possibly thrive. The vault waited in darkness as Rebecca climbed the stairs. $671 million in bearer bonds. 5 years of research that could change thousands of lives, equipment worth millions, and most importantly, on a path forward when all other paths had closed. The twins slept in the back seat during the drive home, exhausted by the day's disruption of routine. Rebecca's hands trembled on the steering wheel, adrenaline and shock creating a chemical cocktail that made focus difficult. In her bag sat documentation that proved the bearer bonds existed, were legitimate, and belonged to her as Elena's sole heir. $671 million. The number felt abstract, disconnected from reality. 3 days ago, she'd had $183 and an eviction notice. Now she possessed wealth that could solve every problem, fund every treatment, secure every possible future for her daughters. The transformation felt too sudden, too complete, too much like the kind of magical thinking she'd trained herself to avoid because hope hurt worse than resignation when it collapsed. James had photographed everything, documented the vault's contents with the thoroughness of someone who understood this discovery would attract attention. He'd recommended immediate steps: secure legal representation, contact the bond issuer to verify authenticity, establish security for the facility, notify insurance companies. But first, Rebecca needed to reach her attorney, not the kind who handled inheritance notifications. She didn't have that kind of attorney. She needed someone who could navigate wealth at a scale that attracted predators and complications. The apartment felt smaller returning to it, the eviction notice still sitting in the drawer with all the other papers documenting their precarious existence. Rebecca transferred both girls to their beds, connected monitors, prepared medications for the night. I completed the routines that structured their survival. Only then did she allow herself to examine the journal more carefully, reading Elena's entries from the final 5 years. The writing revealed a woman working alone with fierce determination, conducting research that no institution would support after FDA rejection. Elena had recruited patients through online support groups, families desperate enough to try experimental treatments when conventional medicine offered only symptom management. The results, documented in careful detail, showed what Rebecca had hoped to find: NG, 7 modifications that worked. Hand stereotypies reduced, communication improvements, seizure frequency decreased, quality of life measures showing significant positive changes in children whose baseline had been steady decline. All conducted outside official oversight because the system had decided Elena's approach was too risky, too unproven, too expensive to justify when simply managing symptoms was cheaper and involved less liability. One entry stopped Rebecca completely. Met Rebecca's daughters in photographs today. Jessica Morgan, from the Rett Syndrome Family Network, shared pictures from a support group meeting. Mia and Maya, 6 years old, identical twins, both showing classic symptoms: hand-wringing, loss of purposeful movement, seizures. Rebecca looks exhausted in every photo, determined, but being ground down by a system that provides minimal support while demanding maximum sacrifice. I could help them. The modified NG7 protocol would be perfect for twins, built-in control and experimental subjects, though I'd never suggest that to Rebecca. And she'd be horrified by the clinical thinking, but I can't reach out. She doesn't know about this work, doesn't know I've continued research after neurogenesis collapsed. Making contact would require explaining everything: the vault, the bonds, the underground trials. She'd think I was insane or criminal or both, so I'll keep working. Complete the protocols, document everything, structure it so when I'm gone, she finds what she needs exactly when she needs it most. The attorney has instructions to notify her only after my death, only after enough time has passed that desperation makes her willing to investigate. It's manipulative. It's cruel in some ways, making her wait, making her struggle. But if I contact her now, she'll refuse out of pride or fear or the reasonable caution that comes from being a scientist who understands how badly underground research can go wrong. Better to let necessity overcome caution. Better to wait until she has no other options. Then she'll use what I've built because her daughters need it more than her principles need defending. Rebecca felt anger and gratitude in equal measure. Her grandmother had known, had watched from a distance while Rebecca struggled, had possessed the means to help, but withheld it deliberately, calculating that desperation would overcome the ethical concerns that wealth and choice would allow. It was manipulation. It was also accurate assessment. If Elena had approached her 3 years ago, Rebecca would have refused, would have cited research ethics, proper protocols. had the dangers of experimental treatments. She'd have protected her daughters from risk because other options still existed. But now, with eviction imminent, with bank accounts empty, with every conventional path closed, now she'd try anything that offered hope of improvement. Elena had understood that and had structured everything to reach her granddaughter at precisely the moment when need would overwhelm caution. The next morning brought chaos that would define the following weeks. Rebecca called the bond issuer first, a financial institution that specialized in bearer bond redemption. The representative's voice shifted from bored routine to sharp attention when Rebecca described what she possessed. "Ma'am, I need to transfer you to our verification department. The bearer bonds of that denomination require extensive authentication procedures." The verification department was more direct. "Ms. Torres, what you're describing represents one of the largest bearer bond collections in private hands. If authentic, the redemption value exceeds $671 million. We'll need to conduct physical examination, verify serial numbers against issuance records, and confirm your legal ownership. This process typically takes 60 to 90 days. I need access to funds before then. My daughters require immediate medical care." Silence stretched. Then a different voice came on the line. Senior Vice President, named Marcus Webb, who spoke with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling extraordinary situations. "Ms. Torres, I understand urgency, but this isn't a normal banking transaction. Our bearer bonds are essentially cash in physical form. Anyone possessing them can redeem them. We need absolute certainty of authenticity and legal ownership before releasing funds. However, given the amounts involved, we can arrange a bridge loan secured by the bonds. If authentication confirms their value, the loan converts to your verified assets. If authentication fails, you're liable for repayment." How large a bridge loan? $50 million, available within 72 hours of physical bond transfer to our secure facility. Interest rate is 8% annually, which is high, but reflects the risk we're assuming. Rebecca did the mathematics. Even if she never touched the principal, $50 million could fund every treatment, every therapy, every experimental protocol her daughters might need. It could restart Elena's research, complete clinical trials. I bring NG 7 modifications to FDA approval. I accept. What's the next step? The next step involved armored transport, insurance policies, and legal documentation that consumed 2 days of Rebecca's life. The bearer bonds moved from Elena's vault to the financial institution's secure facility in San Francisco, accompanied by security that made the transfer feel like a military operation. James Chen, the hazmat assessor who'd become an unexpected ally, recommended an attorney. Patricia Vance, who specialized in intellectual property and pharmaceutical law, someone who'd defended researchers against regulatory overreach and understood the gray areas where desperate scientists operated. Patricia arrived at the laboratory on Thursday, a woman in her 50s who moved with the confidence of someone who'd won cases others considered unwinnable. And she examined Elena's research with the focused attention of someone who understood both the scientific merit and the legal complications. Your grandmother conducted unauthorized clinical trials, not technically illegal if patients consented and no fraud occurred, but ethically questionable and definitely outside FDA oversight. However, the research itself is extraordinary. The NG7 modifications address every concern that killed the original approval process. Can it be used to help my daughters? Patricia's expression softened. Under compassionate use provisions, yes. You'd need to file an investigational new drug application, demonstrate that conventional treatments have failed, show that the modified compound has reasonable safety profiles. Given your daughter's condition and your grandmother's research, or FDA would likely grant expanded access. How long? Expedited review, maybe 6 weeks. Standard review, 6 months. But there's a complication you need to understand. She pulled up news on her tablet, showed Rebecca headlines that made her stomach drop. Abandoned biotech facility contains research worth millions. Elena Torres's secret laboratory discovered. Bearer bonds and experimental drugs. Single mother inherits $671 million from grandmother's underground research. The story had leaked. Probably someone at the financial institution, maybe James Chen, despite confidentiality agreements, possibly the attorney's office. The specifics didn't matter. What mattered was that overnight, Rebecca had become a target. Patricia's warning came blunt and direct. This attention will bring complications. FDA, scrutiny because underground research suggests regulatory evasion. Venture capitalists who will want to buy Elena's intellectual property, patient advocacy groups who will demand you share the research immediately, and people who will simply try to take what you have through legal or illegal means. What should I do? First, secure the facility. Professional security, 24/7 monitoring, limited access. Second, move your daughters somewhere safe. If you're targeted, they're the vulnerability anyone will exploit. Third, hire a medical team to evaluate Elena's research and prepare FDA applications. Fourth, brace yourself for the fight of your life because everyone with an opinion about medical research is about to make you their cause. The security company arrived that afternoon. Former military, are the kind of professionals who treated protection as a technical problem requiring systematic solutions. They installed cameras, sensors, reinforced doors, established monitoring protocols that would alert law enforcement at the first sign of intrusion. The cost was $15,000 for the first month. Rebecca signed the contract without hesitation, using the bridge loan funds that had cleared that morning. Money no longer felt real. Numbers on screens authorizing expenditures that weeks ago would have been impossible now felt routine. She moved the twins to Patricia's recommendation, a private care facility in Palo Alto that specialized in complex medical needs. The cost was $8,000 weekly. Rebecca toured the facility, saw the adaptive equipment, met the staff whose credentials included pediatric neurology and special needs expertise, and understood this was what wealthy families accessed while she'd been struggling with inadequate support. Mia and Maya adapted to the new environment with the resilience children showed when adults provided consistency and care. The facility's occupational therapists began assessments immediately. Physical therapists evaluated mobility needs. The medical director, Dr. Sarah Chen, examined Elena's research with the careful attention of someone who recognized both its potential and its risks. "This is remarkable work," Sarah said after reviewing the protocols. "Your grandmother was onto something significant. The modifications to NG7 address the hepatotoxicity concerns that killed FDA approval. If the trial data holds up under scrutiny, this could be the first real treatment for Rett syndrome beyond symptom management. Can you help me get it approved?" "I can help you prepare the applications, but you need to understand what you're facing. The pharmaceutical industry doesn't like maverick researchers who work outside the system. FDA doesn't like being presented with completed trials they didn't oversee. Patient advocacy groups will be split, some supporting your grandmother's determination, others concerned about safety shortcuts. My daughters are having 15 seizures weekly. They can't communicate beyond eye contact and limited vocalizations. Their quality of life is being destroyed by a condition that conventional medicine can only manage, not treat. I'll face whatever opposition comes if there's a chance this helps them." Sarah nodded slowly. "Then we fight. But we fight smart, document everything, follow every protocol exactly, give them no legitimate grounds to reject the application." The FDA application consumed 3 weeks of Rebecca's life. Every aspect of Elena's research had to be verified, translated into formats regulatory agencies required, organized according to standards that prioritized bureaucratic compliance over scientific merit. The bridge loan funds made it possible. Rebecca hired consultants who specialized in FDA applications, paid for independent analysis of Elena's trial data, commissioned safety reviews that confirmed the modified NG7 compound met manufacturing standards. The cost reached $2.3 million before the application was complete. Numbers that would have been incomprehensible months ago now felt like necessary investments in her daughter's futures. During this period, the media attention intensified. Reporters camped outside the facility. Rebecca's photograph appeared on news websites beneath headlines that ranged from sympathetic to accusatory. Mother's determination versus FDA caution. Who decides what's safe? Underground medical research. Heroic or dangerous? Elena Torres. Visionary scientist or reckless experimenter? Rebecca gave one interview, carefully scripted by Patricia, explaining that her grandmother had been a dedicated researcher who'd continued working after the system abandoned promising treatments. That the bearer bonds represented Elena's personal assets, legally obtained and properly stored. That the research met rigorous scientific standards even if conducted outside traditional oversight. The interview generated predictable responses. The patient advocacy groups split exactly as Sarah had predicted. Some praised Elena's determination. Others worried about encouraging underground research that could endanger vulnerable populations. The pharmaceutical industry's response was more coordinated and more threatening. 3 major companies that had licensed Neurogenesis's intellectual property after the bankruptcy filed suit, claiming Elena's continued research violated licensing agreements. Their argument was simple. Elena had been principal investigator at Neurogenesis. Her research belonged to the company. Therefore, her post-bankruptcy work infringed on intellectual property they'd purchased. Patricia's counter-argument was equally direct. Elena had conducted the research as a private citizen using personal funds. The licensing agreements covered only Neurogenesis's work through 2019. Subsequent modifications and trials constituted new intellectual property that Elena owned personally. The lawsuits would take years to resolve. Meanwhile, Patricia filed countersuits claiming the pharmaceutical companies had abandoned research they'd licensed, failing to develop treatments despite possessing promising candidates. The legal warfare escalated quickly, each side deploying attorneys and arguments designed to protect billions in potential revenue. Rebecca watched this unfold with growing understanding that she'd become the center of a battle about more than just her daughter's treatment. She represented a question the medical establishment couldn't avoid. What happened when dedicated individuals achieved results the system had declared impossible? The FDA's response arrived 6 weeks after application submission. Not approval, but not rejection either. Instead, a request for additional safety data, further verification of trial results, and a site inspection of Elena's laboratory to assess whether the facility met current good manufacturing practice standards. The inspection was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Patricia warned that this was where most applications failed. Inspectors looking for violations that would justify rejection. Bureaucrats protecting themselves by prioritizing risk avoidance over patient benefit. They'll examine every aspect of Elena's work looking for shortcuts, contamination, protocol violations. If they find anything questionable, they'll reject the application and possibly refer the matter for criminal investigation into unauthorized human trials. The research is solid. The research is excellent. But FDA doesn't care about excellence. They care about compliance, documentation, and avoiding any appearance of approving work conducted outside their oversight. We need to prepare the facility perfectly, answer every question definitively, give them no grounds for rejection. The preparation consumed another $800,000. Professional cleaning services that met pharmaceutical standards. Equipment calibration by certified technicians. Documentation systems that tracked every sample, every compound, every trial result with the precision FDA demanded. James Chen returned to assess environmental compliance, so his professional skepticism replaced by something approaching advocacy. Your grandmother built something extraordinary here. The facility exceeds most university laboratory standards. If FDA rejects this, It won't be because the science is bad. It'll be because the system protects itself by rejecting anything that challenges its authority. The inspection team arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October. 3 FDA officials, each carrying clipboards and expressions that suggested they expected to find violations. Rebecca met them with Patricia beside her, both women prepared for confrontation disguised as routine evaluation. The lead inspector, Dr. Raymond Torres, no relation, but the shared surname felt like an ironic reminder of family connections, began with the equipment inventory. Every centrifuge, every incubator, every analytical instrument had to be documented, calibrated, certified as meeting current standards. Elena's meticulous record-keeping saved them. Every piece of equipment had maintenance logs, calibration certificates, usage documentation that proved consistent operation within specifications. Dr. Torres examined the records with an expression that shifted from skeptical to surprised to grudgingly impressed. "Your grandmother maintained this facility alone?" She had occasional assistance from former neurogenesis colleagues, but primarily, yes, she worked alone. "That's extraordinary. Most facilities this size require teams of technicians to maintain equipment properly." The sample storage review took longer. Every compound had to be accounted for, every biological sample documented, and every reagent verified as properly stored and within expiration dates. Elena had organized everything with the precision of someone who understood that future evaluation might depend on proving nothing had been compromised. The trial documentation proved most contentious. FDA regulations required extensive consent procedures, safety monitoring, adverse event reporting. Elena had conducted trials outside the system, but she'd maintained documentation that met or exceeded regulatory standards. The second inspector, Dr. Maria Santos, reviewed patient consent forms with lawyerly attention. These consents are unusually detailed. They acknowledge that the treatment is experimental, not FDA approved, and could cause harm. They include extensive medical history documentation. They describe the theoretical basis for the treatment and the modifications from the original NG7 compound. Dr. Torres believed informed consent required actual information, not just legal protection. Most researchers provide minimal details to avoid overwhelming patients. Your grandmother did the opposite. These consents are better than most FDA-approved trials require. The third inspector, Dr. James Park, focused on the modified NG7 compound itself, chemical analysis, purity testing, stability evaluation. Elena had maintained samples from every batch, allowing verification that manufacturing processes remained consistent across the 5-year research period. "The modifications are clever," Park admitted after reviewing the formulation data. She addressed the hepatotoxicity by changing the metabolic pathway while preserving the neuroplasticity effects. In theory, this should work. The animal studies support it. The human trial data, if we can verify it, suggests significant efficacy. If you can verify it, we need to contact trial participants, confirm they exist, confirm they received the treatment described, confirm the outcomes match what's documented. Your grandmother recruited through online support groups, which makes verification difficult, but not impossible. The verification process stretched across 2 weeks. FDA contacted families from Elena's trials, requested medical records, interviewed patients when communication was possible. Rebecca watched the process with anxiety that made sleep difficult and focus nearly impossible. But Elena's documentation proved accurate. Every patient existed. Every treatment had been administered as described. Every outcome matched the recorded data. Some families expressed gratitude for Elena's willingness to help when no other options existed. Others admitted the treatments hadn't provided significant improvement. None reported serious adverse events or safety concerns that would justify rejection. The FDA's decision arrived on a Friday evening, delivered via email with subject line that made Rebecca's hands shake opening it. IND Application 145782, Expanded Access Determination. The body text was bureaucratic, carefully worded, but the conclusion was clear. Expanded access approved for Mia and Maya Torres under compassionate use provisions. Thus, treatment could proceed under medical supervision with required safety monitoring and outcome reporting. Further clinical trial development would be considered pending results of expanded access treatment. It wasn't full approval. It wasn't vindication of Elena's methods. But it was permission, official, legal, documented permission to give her daughters the treatment their grandmother had spent 5 years perfecting. Rebecca called Sarah Chen immediately. "We're approved. When can we start?" "I'll order the compound from the synthesis lab. We'll need 2 weeks to prepare, get baseline measurements, ensure everything is properly set up. But yes, we can start." The 2 weeks felt simultaneously too long and too fast. Rebecca spent them with the twins, as explaining what would happen in language adapted for their limited verbal comprehension, but presumed cognitive understanding. Mia and Maya both tracked her face with intense focus, their eyes showing the intelligence trapped inside bodies that wouldn't cooperate. "Grandma Elena built medicine that might help you. It might help your hands move better, might help you talk more, might reduce the seizures. We're going to try it together." Maya's hand found hers, squeezing with the limited motor control she possessed. Mia vocalized, sound that might have been approval or might have been unrelated to the conversation, but Rebecca chose to interpret as consent. The first treatment was scheduled for a Monday morning. Private medical suite at the Palo Alto facility, equipped with monitoring systems that would track every physiological response. As Sarah Chen would administer the modified NG7 compound intravenously, starting with conservative doses that prioritized safety over rapid results. Media attention had intensified as news of the FDA approval spread. Camera crews camped outside the facility, reporters requesting interviews, patient advocacy groups issuing statements ranging from celebration to caution. Rebecca ignored all of it, focused entirely on her daughters and the moment that represented everything Elena had worked toward. The morning arrived clear and cold. Rebecca dressed the twins in comfortable clothes, transferred them to the medical suite, held them while Sarah prepared the IV lines. Both girls tolerated the procedure better than expected, their experience with medical interventions making routine what would terrify typical 6-year-olds. "Ready?" Sarah's voice was calm, professional, but her eyes showed the weight of what this moment meant. First administration of an experimental treatment that could either vindicate a grandmother's determination or prove the FDA's caution had been justified. "Ready?" The infusion began. Clear liquid flowing through IV lines into small bodies whose neural development had been disrupted by genetic mutations affecting MECP2 genes. The modified NG7 compound would theoretically enhance neural plasticity, allowing brain pathways to route around damaged areas, providing mechanisms for communication and motor control that Rett syndrome typically prevented. Theoretically. Nothing dramatic happened in the first hour. The girls tolerated the infusion without adverse reactions. Heart rate remained stable, blood pressure normal. No signs of the hepatotoxicity that had killed the original FDA approval. Sarah monitored continuously, checking vitals every 15 minutes, ready to terminate treatment at the first sign of problems. By hour 2, Maya's hand movements had changed. The characteristic ringing motions slowed, became less compulsive. She looked at her hands with an expression that suggested surprise, as though noticing for the first time that she had some control over their behavior. By hour 3, Mia had vocalized more clearly than Rebecca had heard in months. "Mama, hand, look." 3 words, carefully formed, requiring enormous effort, but undeniably purposeful communication. Sarah's careful documentation continued, but her eyes showed cautious optimism. "This is promising. The neural pathway enhancement might be occurring faster than expected. We'll need to monitor closely, but this is exactly the response we'd hoped for. The infusion completed after 4 hours. Both girls were exhausted but showed no adverse effects. Sarah scheduled follow-up assessments for the next day, then weekly for the first month. The treatment protocol would continue for 12 weeks, each infusion theoretically building on previous neural improvements. Rebecca stayed with the twins as they slept, holding Mia's hand, watching Maya's chest rise and fall with breathing that seemed steadier than before. She thought about Elena working alone in the laboratory, conducting research the system had abandoned, preserving everything specifically for this moment. The sacrifice Elena had made, relationships, reputation, a conventional success, suddenly seemed less like tragic waste and more like fierce determination to give her granddaughters possibilities the present couldn't provide. She'd been a difficult woman, obsessive, terrible at expressing love through normal channels. But the vault, the research, the bearer bonds, all represented love expressed in the only language Elena spoke fluently. Dedication to work that might help children she'd never met live better lives than their condition typically allowed. Patricia called that evening with news that shattered Rebecca's cautious optimism. The pharmaceutical companies have filed for an emergency injunction to stop the treatment. They're claiming that administering the modified NG7 violates intellectual property rights they purchased from Neurogenesis. They want immediate cessation pending resolution of their lawsuit. We have FDA approval. How can they stop FDA-approved treatment? They're arguing that FDA approval doesn't override intellectual property rights, that you're essentially using stolen property to treat your daughters. It's legal bullshit, but it's bullshit a judge might temporarily accept pending full hearing. When's the hearing? Thursday. 3 days. If they win the injunction, you'll have to stop treatment immediately. Rebecca felt rage burn through the exhaustion and hope. Pharmaceutical companies that had abandoned this research, that had let NG7 languish undeveloped for 5 years, were now claiming ownership to prevent someone else from helping patients they'd forgotten. Can we win? We can fight. But intellectual property law favors corporate ownership. Even if Elena developed this independently, they'll argue she used knowledge acquired while working at Neurogenesis. That's legally murky territory. The 3 days before the hearing passed in a blur of preparation and continued treatment. Maya and Mia received their second infusions, both showing continued improvement. Maya's hand, stereotypize, decreased further. Mia strung together 4-word sentences. Both girls seemed more present, more engaged, more able to express the intelligence that Rett syndrome typically trapped inside non-compliant bodies. Sarah documented everything meticulously, creating evidence that would demonstrate treatment efficacy regardless of legal outcomes. If they stop this now, it's not about safety or science. It's about money and control. Make sure everyone understands that. The hearing took place in Federal District Court in San Francisco. The courtroom filled with interested parties, patient advocates, pharmaceutical company attorneys, media representatives, medical ethicists, everyone with an opinion about who controlled medical innovation and patient access. Judge Margaret Richardson presided with the particular authority of someone who'd spent decades managing cases where law intersected with human suffering. She listened to the pharmaceutical companies' arguments, intellectual property theft, violation of licensing agreements. Elena Torres's work belonged to them through Neurogenesis bankruptcy acquisition. Then Patricia presented the defense. Elena had used personal funds, worked in a personal facility, developed modifications to compounds years after leaving Neurogenesis. The pharmaceutical companies had abandoned the research, made no effort to develop NG7, and now claimed ownership only after someone else proved the treatments worked. Your Honor, Patricia's voice carried through the courtroom with controlled fury. These companies bought intellectual property 5 years ago and did nothing with it. They let promising treatments languish undeveloped because the FDA approval process seemed too expensive and too uncertain. Dr. Elena Torres continued working because she believed patients deserved better. She spent her own money, risked her own reputation, and created modifications that address every concern that killed original approval. Now these companies want to stop treatment of two 6-year-old girls showing remarkable improvement because protecting their theoretical intellectual property matters more than actual patient benefit. The pharmaceutical company's lead attorney responded with legal arguments about precedent and property rights and the importance of respecting corporate ownership. But his words felt hollow against the reality that Rebecca and Patricia had put in evidence. Two girls with Rett syndrome showing improvement that conventional medicine couldn't provide, facing treatment termination because companies valued money over patients. Judge Richardson asked one question that cut through the legal complexity. Does any plaintiff company currently have an active development program for Rett syndrome treatments? The attorney's answer came reluctant. Not specifically for Rett syndrome, Your Honor, but we maintain research programs in neurological disorders generally. So you've done nothing with the intellectual property you claim is being infringed. You're asking me to stop treatment that's working because sometime in the future you might possibly decide to develop something similar. Do I have that correct? Your Honor, intellectual property protection requires— I understand what intellectual property protection requires, counsel. I also understand that equity sometimes demands considering whether legal rights are being exercised responsibly. You've presented no evidence these companies would have developed this treatment absent Dr. Torres's work. You've shown no harm beyond theoretical ownership claims. Meanwhile, actual patients are showing actual improvement from actual medicine that actually exists. Motion for emergency injunction is denied. We'll address the underlying intellectual property claims in full trial, but there will be no treatment stoppage pending that resolution. The courtroom erupted in reactions ranging from celebration to outrage. Rebecca felt Patricia's hand on her shoulder, steadying her as relief threatened to buckle her knees. We won this round, Patricia warned. But they'll appeal. They'll continue fighting because hundreds of millions are at stake if your grandmother's research becomes widely available. Let them fight. My daughters are improving, that's what matters. The treatment continued over the following weeks. By week 4, Maya was using purposeful hand movements to activate communication devices. Her eyes tracked with better control, selecting words on screen-based systems that gave voice to thoughts previously trapped inside. Mama love you, the device spoke in its synthesized voice, translating Maya's eye movements into words. Medicine helped Maya feel better. Mia's seizure frequency dropped by 60%. Her vocalizations became clearer, approaching conversational speech with therapeutic support. Both girls showed improved motor control, better sleep patterns, enhanced quality of life measures across every assessment category. Sarah Chen's documentation created a compelling case for treatment efficacy. Note, this is exactly what Elena predicted. The modifications work because they address the underlying pathology rather than just managing symptoms. If we can complete full trials, get proper approval, this could help thousands of children. The pharmaceutical company's appeal was denied. Their lawsuit continued, but without immediate power to stop treatment. Other families with Rett syndrome began contacting Rebecca, desperate for access to the modified NG7 compound, willing to try anything that offered hope their children might improve. Patricia worked with FDA to expand the compassionate use program, creating pathways for other patients to receive treatment under medical supervision. The process was slow, bureaucratic, designed to prioritize caution over speed. But it was movement toward making Elena's research available to populations who'd been told no effective treatments existed. Rebecca used the bearer bond wealth to establish the Elena Torres Foundation, dedicated to completing clinical trials and bringing the modified NG7 to full FDA approval. She hired researchers, funded laboratory expansions, created infrastructure for the long process of transforming underground research into legitimate pharmaceutical options. The work was exhausting, complex, fought at every turn by companies protecting profit margins and regulatory agencies protecting themselves from criticism. But Rebecca had learned from her grandmother that some work mattered more than comfort or conventional success. 6 months after the first treatment, Rebecca stood in the facility's therapy room watching her daughters play with other children in the expanded compassionate use program. Maya was using hand movements to paint on an adaptive easel. Mia was talking with another girl, her speech still requiring effort but unmistakably conversational. They would never be typical. Rett syndrome didn't allow typical, but they were better, measurably, observably, significantly better than conventional medicine had suggested possible. And they were receiving treatment their grandmother had developed specifically for them, finished by their mother who'd finally understood what Elena had been trying to teach her. Some inheritances are measured in money, some in property, but the most valuable inheritance Rebecca had received wasn't the bearer bonds or the research or even the laboratory facility. It was understanding that dedication sometimes looked like obsession, that sacrifice sometimes felt like neglect, and that love could be expressed through relentless determination to solve problems the present declared unsolvable. Elena Torres had been a difficult grandmother, but she'd been an extraordinary scientist, and in the end she'd given her granddaughters what mattered most, a future that conventional wisdom said they couldn't have. The clinical trials began in earnest 18 months after Rebecca found the vault. What had started as compassionate use for 2 6-year-old twins had expanded into a comprehensive research program that would either validate Elena's work or expose its limitations under rigorous scientific scrutiny. The FDA had granted approval for Phase 2 trials in March, so a process that typically took years compressed into months by the compelling preliminary data and the unusual circumstance of inheriting fully developed research. Rebecca had funded everything through the Elena Torres Foundation, bypassing the venture capital cycles that had destroyed neurogenesis by prioritizing profit timelines over patient benefit. The foundation's headquarters occupied the building adjacent to Elena's original laboratory, transformed from abandoned industrial space into a state-of-the-art research facility. The cost had been staggering, $47 million for renovations, equipment, and staff recruitment. But the bearer bonds made it possible, wealth deployed specifically for the purpose Elena had intended when she'd converted her fortune into physical assets the bankruptcy proceedings couldn't touch. Maya and Mia were now 8 years old, their progress documented with the precision that regulatory approval required. Maya could speak in complete sentences, her communication still requiring more effort than typical children needed, but unmistakably purposeful and clear. She'd learned to write using adaptive technology, creating stories about girls who discovered they were stronger than everyone thought. Mia's seizure frequency had dropped to twice monthly, down from 15 times weekly before treatment began. Her motor control had improved enough that she could feed herself with adapted utensils, dress with minimal assistance, and navigate their home with increasing independence. Both girls attended a specialized school that understood how to support children whose capabilities exceeded what Rett syndrome typically allowed. Yet the transformation wasn't miraculous. They still faced challenges that would persist throughout their lives. But the trajectory had changed from steady decline to measurable improvement, from managing symptoms to treating underlying pathology. That difference mattered more than any dollar amount the bonds represented. Dr. Sarah Chen had become the Foundation's chief medical officer, her expertise in pediatric neurology combined with passionate advocacy for patients the system had abandoned. She'd recruited a team of researchers, clinicians, and therapists who understood that they weren't just conducting trials, they were fighting to prove that determination and resources could overcome institutional inertia. The Phase 2 trials enrolled 60 children with Rett syndrome, ages 4 to 12. and all showing progression typical of the condition. 20 would receive the modified NG7 compound that Elena had developed. 20 would receive standard supportive care. 20 would receive a placebo designed to control for expectation effects that could skew results. The protocols were rigorous, designed to satisfy the most skeptical FDA reviewers. Double-blind administration, so neither families nor clinicians knew who received active treatment. Comprehensive safety monitoring that would detect adverse events immediately. Outcome measures spanning communication, motor function, seizure frequency, quality of life, and neurological assessments. Rebecca attended the trial kickoff meeting in the Foundation's conference room, surrounded by researchers who'd committed to work that pharmaceutical companies had abandoned as unprofitable. Sarah presented the protocols with the careful precision of someone who understood that every detail mattered when fighting institutional skepticism. "We're not just testing whether the modified NG7 works," Sarah explained to the assembled team. "We're testing whether independent research conducted outside corporate structures can meet the same standards the system demands from billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies. Elena Torres proved it's scientifically possible. We need to prove it's practically achievable at scale." The trials proceeded with the methodical pace that proper research required. Weekly assessments, monthly comprehensive evaluations, quarterly safety reviews by independent monitoring boards, every procedure documented, every outcome measured, every potential concern investigated thoroughly. The preliminary results began emerging after 6 months. The data analysts, blinded to which participants received active treatment versus placebo, reported statistically significant improvements in the treatment group across multiple outcome measures. Hand stereotypies reduced by an average of 53%. Purposeful communication increased by 47%. Seizure frequency decreased by 61%. Quality of life measures showed improvements that parents described as life-changing. The placebo group showed minimal change, confirming that expectation effects weren't driving the observed improvements. The standard care group showed slight decline, consistent with Rett syndrome's typical progression. And the contrast was stark enough that the independent monitoring board recommended early trial termination on ethical grounds. Denying effective treatment to placebo participants couldn't be justified when efficacy was clearly demonstrated. But Sarah argued against early termination. "If we stop now, FDA will question whether the results hold over time. We need 12-month data to demonstrate durability. We need to show that improvements persist, that safety remains acceptable with extended exposure. Cutting the trial short might feel ethical, but it risks undermining approval and preventing thousands of other children from accessing treatment." The monitoring board accepted the argument reluctantly, but mandated that placebo participants be offered crossover to active treatment after month 8, balancing ethical obligations with scientific rigor. The media attention intensified as preliminary results leaked through the informal networks that connected desperate families. Rebecca found herself featured in national news stories, profiled in medical journals, invited to speak at conferences about independent pharmaceutical development and patient-directed research. She declined most invitations, uncomfortable with attention that felt unearned. "I didn't develop the treatment. My grandmother did. I'm just completing what she started." But Patricia, now serving as the Foundation's legal counsel, pushed back. "You're doing more than completing Elena's work. You're demonstrating a model that threatens the pharmaceutical industry's control over medical innovation. That's why they're fighting so hard, and that's why your visibility matters." The pharmaceutical company's lawsuit had evolved into a multi-front legal war. They'd abandoned the intellectual property claims after Judge Richardson's initial ruling suggested those arguments would fail. Instead, they'd shifted to regulatory challenges, filing complaints with FDA alleging that the Foundation's trials didn't meet safety standards, that Rebecca lacked pharmaceutical development expertise, that allowing independent researchers to conduct trials set dangerous precedents. FDA investigated each complaint thoroughly, dispatching inspectors who examined every aspect of the Foundation's work. Each inspection concluded the same way. Protocols met or exceeded regulatory standards. Safety monitoring was comprehensive. Data quality was excellent. The complaints appeared motivated by competitive concerns rather than legitimate safety worries. But the investigations consumed time and resources, requiring Rebecca to hire additional staff whose only job was managing regulatory compliance and responding to inquiries designed to find violations that would justify shutdown. "They're trying to bankrupt us through legal fees and compliance costs," Patricia explained during one particularly frustrating week when 3 separate FDA inquiries arrived simultaneously. "Even if we win every challenge, the cost of defending ourselves could exhaust resources before we reach approval. How much have we spent on legal and regulatory defense? $18 million over the past year. The number would have been incomprehensible 2 years ago. Now it felt like necessary investment in fighting a system that protected incumbent interests by raising barriers too expensive for outsiders to overcome. The bearer bonds made continued fighting possible, but Rebecca wondered how many other potentially valuable treatments had been abandoned simply because their developers couldn't afford the cost of regulatory warfare. The twins continued thriving in ways that justified every dollar spent and every battle fought. Maya had written a short book about her experiences with Rett syndrome, using adaptive technology to compose sentences that captured both the frustration of the condition and the hope that effective treatment provided. The book was published by a small press that specialized in disability narratives and became required reading in special education programs across the country. Mia had developed a passion for art, creating paintings through eye-gaze technology that controlled a robotic arm-holding brushes. Her work showed remarkable sophistication, abstract compositions that seemed to capture emotions and perspectives she couldn't express through conventional speech. A gallery in San Francisco had exhibited her pieces, with proceeds benefiting the Foundation's research. Both girls had become inadvertent advocates for Rett syndrome awareness and treatment development, their visible improvement demonstrating what was possible when someone cared enough to fight institutional resistance. Rebecca watched them with pride that felt almost painful in its intensity, grateful for her grandmother's foresight and her own desperate determination that had led her to that abandoned laboratory. The Phase 2 trial results were published in the New England Journal of Medicine exactly 2 years after the first treatment. The paper, authored by Sarah Chen with Rebecca listed as a co-author representing the Foundation's contribution, presented data that exceeded even optimistic expectations. The modified NG7 compound showed statistically significant improvements across all primary outcome measures. Safety profile was excellent, with no serious adverse events and minimal side effects. The improvements persisted through 12-month follow-up, suggesting durable benefit rather than temporary enhancement. Subgroup analysis showed that younger patients responded better, supporting early intervention as optimal timing. The journal's editorial accompanying the paper acknowledged both the scientific achievement and the unusual circumstances of its development. The Torres et al. Study represents both remarkable scientific success and a troubling commentary on pharmaceutical development systems. That a retired scientist working independently could develop an effective treatment for a condition that major companies abandoned suggests our current model may systematically undervalue therapies for smaller patient populations. The ethical questions raised by Dr. Elena Torres's methods, conducting trials outside FDA oversight, recruiting desperate families, operating in regulatory gray areas, deserve serious consideration. Yet the results force us to ask, if the system cannot or will not develop treatments for rare conditions, what alternatives should exist? What responsibility do we bear when institutional caution prevents helping patients who have no other options? The publication triggered responses that split exactly along the lines Rebecca had anticipated. Patient advocacy groups celebrated the results and demanded FDA fast-track approval. Medical ethicists debated whether Elena's methods set dangerous precedents. Pharmaceutical companies issued statements questioning the trial's validity and suggesting that proper Phase 3 trials would reveal problems the smaller study had missed. FDA's response came in the form of an accelerated approval pathway meeting scheduled for 6 weeks after publication. The meeting would determine whether the Phase 2 results justified approval under provisions designed for serious conditions where no adequate treatment existed, or whether additional trials were required before the modified NG7 could be marketed. Rebecca prepared for the meeting with the same intensity she'd brought to every previous regulatory challenge. The Foundation hired consultants who specialized in FDA presentations, rehearsed responses to anticipated questions, assembled documentation that demonstrated every aspect of the research met or exceeded standards. The meeting took place on a humid June morning in a conference room at FDA headquarters in Maryland. Rebecca sat at a table facing a panel of FDA officials whose expressions ranged from skeptical to cautiously interested. Sarah Chen presented the scientific data. Patricia addressed legal and regulatory questions. Rebecca herself spoke about her daughters and the thousands of other families who desperately needed access to effective treatment. My grandmother spent 5 years developing this treatment because the system decided it wasn't worth pursuing, Rebecca told the panel. She used her own money, worked in her own facility, and conducted research that met rigorous standards even though no one was paying her to do it. She did this because she believed patients deserved better than being told nothing could be done. The results speak for themselves. 60 children showed significant improvement. Safety was excellent. The treatment works. The only question is whether FDA will approve it based on the evidence we've presented, or whether you'll demand additional trials that delay access for years while more children regress and families suffer unnecessarily. The panel's questions continued for 3 hours. Technical queries about compound formulation, manufacturing processes, quality control, safety questions about long-term effects, potential toxicity, interaction with other medications, efficacy questions about whether the improvements represented real therapeutic benefit or measurement artifacts. Sarah and her team answered every question with data, evidence, and the confidence that came from conducting research that could withstand the most rigorous scrutiny. By the meeting's end, Rebecca sensed a shift in the panel's attitude. Not enthusiasm. FDA officials didn't show enthusiasm, but something that looked like acknowledgement that the evidence was too strong to dismiss. The decision arrived 3 weeks later. Accelerated approval granted for the modified NG7 compound, now designated as Elenagen, in honor of Dr. Elena Torres. Approval was conditional on completing post-market safety monitoring and conducting confirmatory Phase 3 trials, but the treatment could be prescribed immediately for patients with genetically confirmed Rett syndrome. Rebecca read the approval letter 3 times before the reality settled. Her grandmother's work, developed underground, conducted outside official channels, preserved through determination and careful planning, had achieved the legitimacy the system had initially denied. Elenagen would be available to any patient whose physician believed it appropriate, covered by insurance, manufactured according to pharmaceutical standards. The victory felt enormous and inadequate simultaneously. Enormous because thousands of families would now have access to treatment. Inadequate because Elena wasn't here to see her life's work validated, because the approval had required fighting battles that shouldn't have been necessary, because the system's resistance had delayed benefit for patients who deserved better. The Foundation partnered with a mid-sized pharmaceutical manufacturer to produce Elenagen at scale. Rebecca negotiated pricing that prioritized patient access over profit maximization, $3,500 per monthly treatment, substantially below what pharmaceutical companies typically charged for rare disease therapies. when the price covered manufacturing costs, ongoing research, and foundation operations, but avoided the unconscionable markups that made some specialty medications cost more than mortgages. The pharmaceutical industry responded predictably, with executives complaining that the precedent would undermine their business models. Rebecca's response in interviews was direct. If your business model depends on charging desperate families hundreds of thousands of dollars for treatments that cost tens of thousands to manufacture, then maybe your business model deserves to be undermined. The first commercial shipments of Ellen Again reached pharmacies in September, 3 years after Rebecca had discovered the vault. Patient enrollment exceeded projections, with over 800 families requesting treatment in the first month. The foundation established a patient assistance program to cover costs for families whose insurance didn't adequately respond, funded by the bearer bond wealth that continued generating returns even as Rebecca deployed hundreds of millions for research and access programs. Maya and Mia attended the foundation's celebration event, both girls wearing dresses they'd selected themselves, an accomplishment that represented independence their condition typically prevented. Maya gave a short speech using her communication device, words she'd composed over several days with therapeutic support. Grandma Elena never met us. She died before we were born. But she knew about us. She knew Mom was struggling. She knew we needed help. So she kept working even when everyone said she should stop. She built medicine to help us when no one else would. Now lots of kids like me and Mia can get better. That's what love looks like. Working really hard to help people you'll never meet. The audience, researchers, clinicians, patient families, foundation staff, responded with sustained applause that acknowledged both Maya's courage in speaking and the truth of her words. Rebecca stood beside her daughters, holding their hands, thinking about the grandmother who'd shown love in the only language she spoke fluently. The Phase 3 trials commenced that fall, enrolling 300 children across 20 medical centers. The expanded trials would provide additional safety data, confirm efficacy in broader populations, and satisfy FDA's requirements for converting accelerated approval into full approval. But unlike the Phase 2 trials, and these participants would all receive active treatment, FDA had agreed that withholding effective therapy from placebo groups couldn't be ethically justified now that approval existed. The foundation continued expanding beyond Rett syndrome. Elena's research had focused specifically on that condition, but the underlying science enhancing neural plasticity to route around developmental damage had applications to other disorders. Research programs began exploring whether modified approaches could help children with autism, cerebral palsy, traumatic brain injuries. Rebecca recruited researchers who'd been marginalized by the conventional system, scientists whose ideas were considered too risky, too unconventional, too focused on small patient populations to attract commercial funding. And the foundation became a haven for serious research that pharmaceutical companies wouldn't touch because profit projections didn't justify investment. The cost was substantial. The foundation burned through $150 million annually funding research, clinical trials, patient assistance, and operational expenses. But the bearer bonds had appreciated considerably since their redemption. The $671 million had grown to nearly $900 million through conservative investments that prioritized stability over aggressive returns. Patricia calculated that the foundation could operate indefinitely at current spending levels, essentially becoming a permanent counterweight to pharmaceutical industry indifference toward rare conditions. Elena didn't just give you money, Patricia observed during one financial review. She gave you the ability to rebuild how medical research works for populations the system ignores. The legal battles continued, though with diminishing intensity. The pharmaceutical companies had mostly abandoned their challenges after Elanagan's approval eliminated their standing to claim harm. But new disputes emerged around intellectual property, with the foundation defending its right to develop additional compounds based on Elena's research platform. The fights were exhausting, expensive, and felt like fighting the same battle repeatedly against opponents who had infinite resources and infinite patience. But Rebecca had learned from her grandmother that some work required persistence beyond what seemed reasonable. That transformative change came only through refusing to accept that the present arrangement was inevitable. On the 4th anniversary of finding the vault, Rebecca stood in Elena's original laboratory, now preserved as a museum exhibit within the Foundation's headquarters. The walls still held the original equipment, the notebooks, the evidence of solitary work conducted with fierce determination. Visitors, patient families, medical students, researchers toured regularly, learning about the scientist who'd refused to quit even when the system declared her work worthless. A new addition to the exhibit had been installed that morning. A photograph of Maya and Mia, age 10, standing together outside the Foundation building. Maya held a communication device. Mia held a paintbrush. Both girls were smiling with the genuine joy of children who'd exceeded every limitation their diagnosis had predicted. Beneath the photograph, a plaque carried words Rebecca had written: Dr. Elena Torres, 1942 to 2019, neuroscientist, grandmother, visionary. She worked alone in this laboratory, developing treatments the world dismissed as impossible. She sacrificed relationships, reputation, and conventional success to pursue research that might help her granddaughters live fuller lives than their condition typically allowed. She died before seeing her work validated, before meeting the children who would benefit from her determination, before knowing that her sacrifice mattered. But she built this foundation through dedication that transcended personal recognition. This laboratory stands as testimony that one person's determination can change thousands of lives. That institutional failure doesn't justify individual surrender. That sometimes the most valuable inheritance is understanding that love requires working toward futures you'll never see. Rebecca touched the plaque, thinking about the grandmother she'd barely known, whose methods she'd initially questioned, whose choices had seemed selfish until she'd understood their purpose. Elena had been difficult, obsessive, terrible at conventional relationships. But she'd also been brilliant, determined, and willing to sacrifice everything for the possibility that her granddaughters might thrive. The vault had contained $671 million in bearer bonds. But the real treasure had been understanding that some problems demanded solving regardless of institutional consensus, that patient benefit mattered more than regulatory comfort, that determination could overcome obstacles the present declared insurmountable. And Sarah Chen found Rebecca in the laboratory, carrying tablets with data from the most recent trial assessments. You need to see these numbers. The Phase 3 trial is showing even better results than Phase 2. 92% of participants showing significant improvement. Safety profile remains excellent. We're going to have data that makes full FDA approval automatic. How long until we can file? 6 more months of follow-up, then analysis and submission preparation. Figure 18 months total until full approval. After that, Elanagan becomes standard of care for Rett syndrome. Insurance coverage becomes mandatory. Every child diagnosed will have access to treatment that actually works. Rebecca looked at the laboratory equipment, the notebooks, the evidence of Elena's solitary dedication. She would have liked knowing that. I would have liked seeing it work. She knew it would work. That's why she structured everything the way she did. The bonds to fund development, the research to provide the foundation, the vault to preserve it all until someone cared enough to finish what she started. She planned for this exact outcome. The twins were waiting in the Foundation's community room, participating in an art therapy session with other children receiving Elanagan treatment. Rebecca watched through the observation window as Maya worked on a collaborative mural, directing other children through her communication device, demonstrating leadership abilities her diagnosis supposedly prevented. Mia painted independently, her brushstrokes showing improving motor control, her focus sustained for periods that would have been impossible before treatment. Both girls had progressed beyond what conventional medicine declared achievable, but they still faced challenges that would persist throughout their lives. That was the reality of Rett syndrome even with effective treatment. Ellenagen didn't cure the condition. It didn't eliminate all symptoms. It didn't make affected children typical. But it gave them possibilities that wouldn't have existed otherwise, communication that would have remained trapped, independence that standard care couldn't provide. That difference between managing inevitable decline and enabling improvement justified every dollar spent, every battle fought, every hour of work completing what Elena had started. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a message from Patricia. Judge approved the intellectual property settlement. All pharmaceutical company claims dismissed with prejudice. We own Elena's research platform completely. No more legal challenges to developing additional compounds. The news felt like the final piece settling into place. The legal warfare that had consumed millions in resources and years of attention was finished. The Foundation could focus entirely on research, on trials, on bringing treatments to patients who needed them. 5 years ago, Rebecca had been facing eviction, living on $183, watching her daughters decline while conventional medicine offered only sympathy and symptom management. Now she directed a foundation with assets approaching $1 billion, employed 120 researchers and clinicians, and had brought to market a treatment that was changing thousands of lives. The transformation felt surreal, impossible, like something that happened to other people in stories rather than real life. But the evidence surrounded her. Children improving, families hopeful, research progressing toward additional treatments. That evening, Rebecca returned to the house she'd purchased 2 years earlier, an accessible home designed specifically for the twins' needs. The cost had been absurd, $4.2 million for a property that met every requirement for children with complex motor and communication challenges. But the bearer bonds made it possible, wealth deployed specifically for the purpose Elena had intended. Maya and Mia were doing homework at the adaptive workstations Rebecca had installed in their study. Maya was writing an essay about historical figures who'd overcome adversity. But Mia was solving math problems using eye gaze technology that tracked her vision and translated it into answers. Both looked up when Rebecca entered, their faces showing the immediate recognition and joy that Rett syndrome typically prevented. "Mama home!" Mia's voice came clear, requiring effort but unmistakably purposeful. Maya's communication device spoke her composed message. "We had good day. Learned about Helen Keller. She's like us. Different communication, but still smart." Rebecca sat between them, holding them close, feeling gratitude for the grandmother who'd made this moment possible. "You know what Grandma Elena would say if she saw you now?" "What?" Mia asked. "She'd say that the work was worth it, that every hour in the laboratory, every sacrifice, every choice that seemed selfish was actually the most selfless thing she could do, because she was building futures for people she'd never meet." Maya worked on her device, composing a longer response. When finished, the synthesized voice read, "Grandma was hero. She saved us even though she died before we were born. That's the best kind of hero, someone who helps people they'll never see helped." The observation carried wisdom beyond Maya's years, but also truth that couldn't be denied. Elena Torres had been many things: difficult mother, absent grandmother, obsessive researcher. But she'd also been heroic in the ways that mattered most, dedicating her final years to work that would benefit her granddaughters long after she was gone. Rebecca thought about the eviction notice that had arrived 5 years ago, and the letter from the attorney that had seemed too impossible to be real, the vault beneath the laboratory that had contained both wealth and purpose. The entire sequence felt orchestrated, timed precisely to reach her when desperation would overcome caution. Elena had planned it that way, had understood her granddaughter well enough to predict how she'd respond, what she'd need, when she'd be willing to accept help and finish work that needed completing. The manipulation was extraordinary. The love behind it was even more so. The Foundation's 5-year plan, presented to the board the following week, outlined an ambitious expansion. 15 new research programs targeting rare neurological conditions, clinical trials for modified compounds addressing autism, cerebral palsy, and developmental delays. See manufacturing partnerships to produce treatments at costs that prioritized access over profit. The projected budget was staggering, $800 million over 5 years, essentially deploying Elena's entire fortune toward transforming how rare disease research was conducted and funded. Some board members expressed concern about spending down the endowment so aggressively, but Rebecca's response was direct. My grandmother didn't save this money to sit in investment accounts. She saved it to help patients. If we spend every dollar bringing effective treatments to families who need them, that's exactly what she intended. The goal isn't preserving wealth. It's using wealth to change medicine. The board approved the plan unanimously. The clinical trials expanded throughout the following year. Elenogen became available in 17 countries through partnerships with international regulators who recognized FDA approval as meeting their standards. Patient enrollment reached 5,000 children globally, all receiving treatment that pharmaceutical companies had declared unprofitable to develop. The outcomes data continued supporting initial results. Average improvement in communication measures exceeded 50%. Motor function gains averaged 40%. Seizure reduction averaged 65%. Quality of life improvements were described by families as transformative, life-changing, answering prayers they'd stopped believing would be answered. Not every patient responded equally. Some showed minimal improvement. A few experienced side effects that required treatment discontinuation. But the overall efficacy was undeniable. Sufficient that medical guidelines were updated to recommend Elenogen as first-line treatment for newly diagnosed Rett syndrome. The Foundation's research programs began yielding results beyond the original focus. A modified compound for autism showed promise in early trials. A cerebral palsy treatment demonstrated potential for improving motor function in patients whose conditions had previously been considered fixed. Traumatic brain injury protocols suggested that neuroplasticity enhancement could aid recovery beyond what conventional rehabilitation achieved. Each success built on Elena's fundamental insight that neural development disorders could be treated by enhancing the brain's natural capacity to root around damage, that plasticity could be pharmacologically enhanced, that conditions declared untreatable were actually just undertreated, because no one had cared enough to do the difficult work of developing solutions. Maya turned 12 showing capabilities that would have been impossible before treatment. She'd published 3 books, become an advocate for disability rights, and spoke regularly at conferences about her experiences living with Rett syndrome. Her communication device had become an extension of herself, translating thoughts into words with increasing efficiency as her motor control improved. Mia's artwork had gained recognition in the disability arts community, with galleries specifically requesting her pieces for exhibitions showcasing how adaptive technology enabled creative expression. She'd begun teaching other children with motor challenges how to use eye gaze systems for painting, becoming a mentor to younger patients struggling with the same limitations she'd overcome. Both girls attended mainstream school with support services, achieved grade-level academics, and had friendships with typical peers who accepted their differences without making those differences definitional. They would always have Rett syndrome, but the syndrome no longer defined the boundaries of what they could achieve. Rebecca watched them grow with pride that felt physical, a pressure in her chest that threatened to overflow whenever she thought about the trajectory they'd escaped. Without Elena's work, both girls would likely be largely nonverbal, completely dependent for daily care, experiencing steady regression that would have progressively limited their capabilities. Instead, they were thriving, not cured, not typical, but living full lives that included communication, learning, creativity, and independence. The difference between those outcomes justified everything: the legal battles, the regulatory warfare, the exhausting work of completing research and bringing treatments to approval. The Foundation's 10th anniversary celebration took place in a venue large enough to accommodate the 800 people who wanted to attend. Patient families, researchers, clinicians, advocates, and journalists who'd followed the story from desperate inheritance through pharmaceutical approval to established institution. Rebecca stood before them, looking out at faces representing thousands of lives changed by Elena's determination and her own completion of work that should never have been necessary, but absolutely was. 10 years ago, I was facing eviction. My daughters were declining, and conventional medicine told me nothing could be done. Then I found a letter from a grandmother I barely knew, directing me to a laboratory I didn't know existed, containing research I didn't know she'd conducted. What I found in that vault wasn't just money, though the $671 million in bearer bonds made everything else possible. What I found was proof that one person's determination could change thousands of lives. That institutional failure didn't justify individual surrender. That sometimes the most valuable inheritance is understanding that love requires working toward futures you'll never see. My grandmother died before meeting her granddaughters. She never knew if her research would work, if anyone would finish what she started, if the sacrifices she made would matter. But she built everything we've accomplished, because she refused to accept that some patients didn't deserve effective treatments just because their conditions affected small populations. In the past decade, we've brought Ellenagen to approval and made it available to over 12,000 patients globally. We've launched research programs for 15 additional conditions. We've demonstrated that independent pharmaceutical development can succeed when properly resourced and driven by patient benefit rather than profit maximization. But the real measure of our success isn't in the numbers. It's in the children who can communicate when they couldn't before. The families who have hope when they'd been told to accept inevitable decline. The futures that exist now that wouldn't have existed if my grandmother had accepted the system's verdict that her work wasn't worth pursuing. She gestured to where Maya and Mia sat in the front row, both girls wearing expressions of pride and understanding. My daughters are alive and thriving because one woman refused to quit. Because she believed patients deserved better, because she was willing to sacrifice everything, reputation, relationships, conventional success, to pursue work that mattered more than comfort. That's Elena Torres's legacy. Not the money, not the laboratory, not even the specific treatments she developed. Her legacy is proving that determined individuals can change systems that seem immutable. That love sometimes looks like obsessive dedication to work that benefits people you'll never meet. And that the future doesn't have to accept the present's limitations. The audience rose in sustained applause, acknowledging both Rebecca's words and the woman whose absence was felt throughout the celebration. Elena Torres had never received public recognition during her lifetime, had died apparently forgotten by the scientific community that had once celebrated her early work. But this room, these people, these lives changed, represented recognition that transcended awards or accolades. Elena's work had mattered. Her sacrifice had been justified. Her determination had changed the world in ways both specific and profound. After the formal program concluded, Rebecca found herself in Elena's preserved laboratory, now a museum that thousands of visitors toured annually. She stood before the photograph of her younger self with her grandmother, at the image that had hidden the key to the vault, and felt the weight of inheritance finally settling into something that felt like peace. She understood now what Elena had been trying to teach her, that some work mattered more than relationships conducted in conventional ways. That love could be expressed through dedication to solving problems that would benefit people you'd never meet. That sacrifice made in service of future generations was the most profound expression of care that humans could offer. Elena had been a difficult woman, obsessive, terrible at expressing emotion, incapable of balancing work and family in ways society demanded. But she'd also been heroic in the ways that mattered most, willing to risk everything to help children she'd never know, determined to complete work that institutions had abandoned, fierce in her commitment to patient benefit over personal comfort. The vault had contained treasure measured in hundreds of millions of dollars, but the real inheritance had been understanding that some problems demanded solving regardless of personal cost. That determination could overcome obstacles the system declared insurmountable, that one person's work could change thousands of lives if they cared enough to persist beyond what seemed reasonable. Rebecca touched the photograph, thinking about the grandmother who'd shown love in the only language she spoke fluently, whose methods had seemed questionable until their purpose became clear, whose absence hurt more now that she understood what Elena had sacrificed. "Thank you," she whispered to the image, to the memory, to the legacy that continued expanding with each patient treated and each life improved. "Thank you for refusing to quit. Thank you for building something that lasted. Thank you for loving us in the only way you knew how." The laboratory stood silent. Equipment preserved, notebooks cataloged, evidence of solitary dedication maintained for future generations who would learn about the scientist who'd worked alone and changed everything. Outside, the Foundation continued its work. Researchers pursuing treatments, clinicians caring for patients, families hoping for futures that Elena Torres had made possible. Maya and Mia were waiting in the community room, surrounded by other children whose lives had been transformed by work begun in this laboratory decades ago. Both girls looked up when Rebecca entered, their faces showing immediate recognition and joy. "Mama, come see!" Mia called, her voice clear and purposeful. "We made surprise!" The surprise was a mural collaborative artwork created by 20 children in the Foundation's treatment program. The centerpiece showed a laboratory with a single figure working alone, Elena Torres, rendered by children who'd never met her, but whose lives she'd saved nonetheless. Around the central image, the children had painted themselves, communicating, moving, learning, thriving in ways their condition supposedly prevented. Each figure included details personal to that child. Maya with her communication device, Mia with her paintbrush, others with their own adaptive technologies and accomplishments. At the bottom, carefully lettered by multiple hands working together, was a message that captured everything Elena's work had achieved. "Thank you, Dr. Torres, for not giving up on us. We're living the futures you built. We're proving that different doesn't mean less. We're showing the world that some problems can be solved when someone cares enough to try." Rebecca stood before the mural, tears streaming down her face, feeling the weight of inheritance finally transforming into something that felt like completion. Her grandmother's work wasn't finished. Research continued, trials proceeded, new treatments were being developed. But the purpose had been achieved, the legacy secured, the proof established that determination and resources could change what seemed unchangeable. Some inheritances are measured in money, some in property. But the most valuable inheritance Rebecca had received was understanding that love transcended conventional expression, that sacrifice made for future generations justified present suffering, and that one person's determination could literally save thousands of lives. The vault had held $671 million in bearer bonds and research worth infinitely more. But the real treasure had been the lesson Elena Torres had taught through her life's work, that some problems demand solving regardless of institutional consensus, that patient benefit matters more than regulatory comfort, and that futures can be built by people who'll never see them realized. Rebecca held her daughters close, surrounded by children whose lives proved Elena's legacy, and understood finally what her grandmother had known all along, that the best inheritance isn't what you receive, but what you choose to do with it, and that love's truest expression is working toward futures you'll never see, but must build anyway. because some people deserve better than the present can provide. The foundation would continue, the research would expand, more treatments would be developed, more lives changed, more futures created that wouldn't have existed if Elena Torres had accepted the verdict that her work wasn't worth pursuing. That was the inheritance. That was the treasure. That was the legacy worth more than any dollar amount could measure. And in a laboratory that had once been forgotten, but now stood as testament to determination and love. So Elena Torres's work continued through the granddaughter who'd finished what she started, and the thousands of families who lived better lives because one woman had refused to quit. The morning light filtered through the foundation's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting geometric patterns across the conference table where Rebecca sat reviewing the quarterly impact report. 13 years had passed since she'd discovered Elena's vault, and the numbers still had the power to make her pause in disbelief. Elanagan was now prescribed in 47 countries. Over 38,000 patients had received treatment. The modified compound had become the global standard of care for Rett syndrome, with insurance coverage mandated in most developed nations and patient assistance programs, covering costs in regions where healthcare systems couldn't afford the $3,500 monthly price. But the Foundation's reach had expanded far beyond that original treatment. 6 additional compounds were now in various stages of development, each targeting conditions the pharmaceutical industry had deemed unprofitable. 3 had reached Phase 3 trials. 2 were under FDA review for accelerated approval. 1 had just been granted breakthrough therapy designation, fast-tracking development for a cerebral palsy treatment that showed remarkable efficacy in restoring motor function. The financial projections showed the Foundation operating sustainably through perpetuity. Elena's bearer bonds, initially valued at $671 million, had grown through careful management and reinvestment to over $1.4 billion. Annual research expenditures approached $200 million. Yet the endowment continued growing faster than programs could deploy funds. Rebecca had struggled with that abundance initially, feeling almost guilty that resources exceeded immediate needs. But Sarah Chen had reframed the challenge during a budget meeting 2 years earlier. Elena didn't just give you money to solve one problem. She gave you the capacity to rebuild pharmaceutical development for rare diseases permanently. The fact that we have more resources than immediate needs means we're not thinking big enough. That conversation had sparked the Global Rare Disease Initiative, as an ambitious program that provided grants to researchers worldwide pursuing treatments for conditions affecting fewer than 10,000 patients. The Foundation funded early-stage research that conventional sources wouldn't touch, bridging the gap between academic discovery and clinical development. In the past 2 years, the initiative had funded 83 research projects across 26 countries. 12 had progressed to clinical trials. 3 showed promise significant enough that larger pharmaceutical companies were now expressing interest in licensing the treatments for commercial development. Exactly the model Rebecca had envisioned. "We prove the concept works," she'd explained to the Foundation's board. "We take the risk that commercial entities won't accept. Then, when success becomes obvious, we partner with companies who have distribution infrastructure to bring treatments to scale. We keep prices reasonable through licensing agreements that prioritize patient access. Everyone benefits except the profit maximization model that was failing patients." The model was working. Each successful treatment validated the approach, attracting more researchers, more patients, more attention to populations the system had systematically underserved. The Foundation had become simultaneously research institution, pharmaceutical developer, patient advocate, and proof that alternative models could succeed when properly resourced. Maya entered the conference room carrying her tablet, now 17 years old and preparing college applications. She'd become an extraordinary young woman, saw her early challenges with Rett syndrome visible only to those who knew what to look for. Her speech required slightly more effort than typical teenagers needed. Her hand movements occasionally showed traces of the stereotypies that had once dominated her motor function, but she communicated fluently, wrote prolifically, and had developed into an eloquent advocate for disability rights. Mom, the college essay question asks about overcoming adversity. I need your help figuring out how to write about Rett syndrome without making it the only thing about me. Rebecca smiled, recognizing the challenge. Maya's story was compelling. Diagnosed at 18 months, treated with experimental therapy at 6, thriving beyond what medical science had predicted possible. But reducing her to that narrative felt reductive, and diminishing the fullness of who she'd become. What else do you want them to know about you? Maya considered the question with the seriousness she brought to everything. That I write because I have things to say, not because communication was hard and now it's easier. That I advocate for disability rights because society needs changing, not because I'm inspirational. That I'm applying to study bioethics because medical research needs people who understand what it's like to be the patient in the trials, not just the scientist conducting them. Then write that. Acknowledge the Rett syndrome as context, but focus on who you are, not what you've overcome. Maya nodded, making notes on her tablet. The college counselor said I should emphasize the experimental treatment angle. Make it dramatic. Dying girl saved by grandmother's secret research. But that's not accurate. I wasn't dying. I was living with a condition that limited me. Grandma's research expanded those limits. It's different. The distinction mattered. Rett syndrome wasn't terminal in most cases. It was limiting, challenging, requiring constant adaptation and support. But the narrative that outsiders found compelling, miraculous cure, desperate rescue, life saved from death, missed the reality that most disability experiences involved navigating limitations rather than escaping them entirely. You're right. Tell your story accurately, even if it's less dramatic than what people expect. After Maya left, Rebecca returned to the impact report, reading testimonials from families whose children had received treatment. And the stories varied in details but shared common themes. Children communicating when they couldn't before, families hoping when they'd been told to accept decline, futures opening that had seemed foreclosed. One letter stood out, from a mother in rural Indonesia whose daughter had received Ellen again through the Foundation's International Assistance Program. Before treatment, my daughter Sari could not speak, could not feed herself, had seizures daily. Doctors said nothing could help, that we should accept her condition. But then your Foundation's program brought medicine to our clinic. Now Sari says words. She uses her hands to eat, to play. Seizures are rare. She goes to school with other children. You gave us hope when we had none. You proved doctors wrong when they said nothing changes. Thank you for not forgetting children in small countries far from rich hospitals. Rebecca filed the letter with hundreds of others, testimonials she returned to whenever the work felt overwhelming or the opposition seemed insurmountable. These families represented why Elena's sacrifice had mattered, why completing her work had been necessary, why fighting institutional resistance had been worth every exhausting moment. Mia appeared in the doorway, 17 and carrying a portfolio of her latest artwork. She'd developed into a remarkable artist, her pieces exhibited internationally and selling for amounts that still surprised Rebecca. The commissions funded Mia's personal charitable foundation, which provided adaptive technology to children whose families couldn't afford the equipment that had enabled her own artistic expression. Mom, the gallery wants to do a retrospective, 13 years of work, showing how my style evolved as my motor control improved. They want to include early pieces from before treatment to show the progression. Rebecca understood the curatorial logic, but recognized the complexity. How do you feel about that? Putting your early struggles on display? Mia set down her portfolio, considering the question with the thoughtful deliberation both twins brought to decisions that mattered. At first, I hated the idea, like they're exploiting my disability for emotional impact. But then I thought about kids who are where I was at 6, struggling to control their bodies, frustrated that their hands won't do what they want. If seeing my progression helps them understand that treatment can help, that improvement is possible, and maybe the display serves a purpose beyond voyeurism, as long as you're comfortable with it. I'm not comfortable with it, but I think it matters more than my comfort. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense. Both twins had developed a sophisticated understanding that their visibility as Rett syndrome patients who'd benefited from Ellen again carried responsibilities they hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. They represented hope for families desperate for reasons to believe improvement was possible. That representation required sharing aspects of their lives that typical teenagers could keep private. The weight of that responsibility concerned Rebecca. She'd tried protecting them from becoming symbols, poster children for experimental treatments, inspirational narratives that flattened their full humanity into digestible stories. But they'd both chosen advocacy deliberately, understanding that their voices carried authority that researchers and clinicians couldn't replicate. "You're both more mature than I was at your age," Rebecca admitted. "More thoughtful about how personal choices have public implications." Mia smiled. "We had good teachers. You showed us that some visibility serves purposes beyond personal comfort. Grandma Elena proved that some work matters more than privacy or conventional success." That evening, Rebecca drove to the cemetery where Elena was buried, a ritual she'd maintained monthly since understanding what her grandmother had accomplished. The headstone was simple, listing only Elena's name and dates. No mention of her scientific achievements, the lives she'd changed, the legacy she'd created. Aunt Rebecca had offered to replace it with something more elaborate, something acknowledging Elena's contributions. But the cemetery director had explained that Elena's will specifically requested minimal marking. Let the work speak. Headstones are for those who need their accomplishments carved in stone to be remembered. So Rebecca brought flowers instead, sitting on the bench beside the grave, reporting on the Foundation's progress, the twins' development, the expanding reach of work Elena had started. Maya's applying to college. She wants to study bioethics to help shape how research treats patients. Mia's having a gallery retrospective showing 13 years of artistic development that wouldn't have been possible without your treatment. They're both extraordinary. And they're extraordinary because you refuse to quit. The Foundation's helping 38,000 patients now. Ellen again's the standard of care in 47 countries. We're developing 6 additional treatments. We've funded 83 research projects through the Global Rare Disease Initiative. Everything you built is growing beyond what you probably imagined possible. The words felt inadequate, unable to capture the magnitude of what Elena had achieved or the gratitude Rebecca felt for the grandmother who'd shown love through fierce dedication rather than conventional affection. Elena had died alone, apparently forgotten, seemingly defeated by a system that had declared her work worthless. But 13 years later, her legacy lived in tens of thousands of improved lives, in research that continued expanding, and in a model that had proven alternatives to pharmaceutical profit maximization could succeed. She'd been vindicated completely, even if she'd never known it would happen. A voice interrupted Rebecca's thoughts. "I thought I might find you here." Patricia Vance, now in her late 60s, approached with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested activity, but whose determination overrode discomfort. She'd remained the Foundation's chief legal counsel, defending against challenges, negotiating partnerships, ensuring that Elena's vision remained protected from forces that would dilute it toward conventional profit-seeking. "The pharmaceutical companies are making another run at us," Patricia said, sitting beside Rebecca. 3 major firms filed suit claiming our pricing model constitutes unfair competition, that they want courts to force us to charge market rates for Ellen again, arguing that our $3,500 monthly price undercuts their ability to develop competing treatments. Rebecca felt familiar anger rise. The argument was absurd. These companies had abandoned Rett syndrome research as unprofitable, had done nothing to develop treatments, and now claimed victim status because the foundation's pricing prioritized patient access over profit maximization. What are our chances? Excellent. Courts have consistently rejected attempts to force charitable organizations to adopt commercial pricing models. But it'll be expensive to defend, probably $5 million in legal fees before it's resolved. File the counterclaims. Sue them for fraudulent legal actions designed to harass competitors. Make it expensive for them, too. Patricia nodded with satisfaction. I was hoping you'd say that. We're not just defending anymore. We're showing that fighting back costs them more than leaving us alone. After Patricia left, Rebecca remained on the bench, thinking about the endless battles required to maintain work that should have been celebrated rather than attacked. Every success attracted opposition from entities whose business models depended on scarcity, high prices, and controlled access to life-saving treatments. Fighting them was exhausting. But the alternative, allowing profit maximization to dominate medical research, was unacceptable. Elena had proven that different approaches could succeed. The Foundation's continued existence demonstrated that patient-centered pharmaceutical development was viable when properly resourced. That model threatened powerful interests, which explained the constant legal warfare, the regulatory challenges, the coordinated attacks disguised as concern about safety or competition. But Rebecca had learned from her grandmother that some work required fighting beyond what seemed reasonable. That transformative change came only through refusing to accept that the present arrangement was inevitable. The sun was setting when Rebecca finally left the cemetery, driving toward the house where both twins waited with their homework, their art projects, their college application essays. They were thriving in ways that justified every battle fought and every dollar spent completing Elena's work. That night, Rebecca sat at her desk, composing the Foundation's annual letter to donors and supporters. The tradition had begun 5 years earlier, and communicating directly with the thousands of families whose lives had been changed by Elena's research and the Foundation's work expanding it. She wrote about the 38,000 patients now receiving Ellen again, the 6 treatments in development, the Global Rare Disease Initiative funding research worldwide. She described Maya and Mia's continued progress, now 17 and preparing for adult independence that Rett syndrome typically prevented. She acknowledged the ongoing legal battles and the opposition from pharmaceutical companies whose business models the Foundation threatened. But mostly, she wrote about Elena. 13 years ago, I discovered that my grandmother, a woman I barely knew, had spent her final years developing treatments for a condition affecting her granddaughters. She'd worked alone, outside official channels, and using personal resources when the system declared her research unprofitable. She'd structured everything to reach me precisely when desperation would overcome caution, when I'd be willing to complete work she couldn't finish. That inheritance, $671 million in bearer bonds and research worth infinitely more, has changed tens of thousands of lives. But the real treasure was the lesson Elena taught, that determined individuals can challenge systems that seem immutable, that patient benefit matters more than profit maximization, and that love sometimes requires working toward futures you'll never see. This foundation continues her work, expanding her legacy, proving daily that pharmaceutical development can serve patients when freed from demands that every treatment generate maximum returns. We're not anti-profit, we're pro-patient. And we believe medicine should be measured by lives improved rather than shareholders enriched. That belief attracts opposition from powerful interests who profit from the current system. But it also attracts support from thousands of families who understand that some work matters more than quarterly earnings. Your contributions, your advocacy, your willingness to fight alongside us makes this possible. Elena Torres died apparently alone, seemingly defeated. never knowing if her work would matter. 13 years later, her legacy grows daily through every patient treated, every family helped, every treatment developed. She proved that one person's determination could change thousands of lives. We're proving that her model can transform how medicine serves populations the system has abandoned. Thank you for being part of this work. Thank you for believing that alternatives to profit maximization can succeed. Thank you for helping us honor Elena's legacy by continuing to expand it. Rebecca sent the letter to the Foundation's communications team for distribution, then climbed the stairs to check on the twins. Both were asleep, Maya with her tablet showing half-finished college essays, Mia with her sketchbook displaying preliminary drawings for the gallery retrospective. She stood in their doorways, watching them sleep, thinking about the trajectory they'd escaped and the futures Elena had made possible. Without her grandmother's work, both girls would likely be significantly disabled, dependent for basic care, experiencing steady regression. Instead, they were preparing for college, pursuing passions, living full lives that included independence and possibility. And that difference between limitation and potential, between managing decline and enabling growth, was measured in more than medical outcomes. It was measured in Maya's college essays and Mia's artwork, in friendships and experiences, and the ordinary extraordinariness of teenagers becoming adults. Elena had given them that. Had worked alone in a laboratory, conducting research the system dismissed, preserving everything for the moment when her granddaughter would be desperate enough to finish what she'd started. The manipulation was extraordinary. The love behind it was even more so. Rebecca returned to her study, finding the journal Elena had left in the vault. She'd read it hundreds of times over the years, finding new meaning in passages that revealed her grandmother's thinking, her strategies, and her recognition that some work required sacrifice beyond what conventional relationships could accommodate. One entry, dated a month before Elena's stroke, captured everything. I'll never meet my granddaughters. I'll never know if this works, if Rebecca finds the vault, if the treatments help or harm. I'll die alone, apparently forgotten, without seeing whether 40 years of work matters. But I can't quit. Because quitting means accepting that some children don't deserve effective treatments simply because their conditions affect small populations. Quitting means letting institutions determine what research matters based on profit potential rather than patient need. Quitting means my granddaughters suffer when I have the capacity to help them. So I keep working. I keep documenting. I keep preserving everything so that when Rebecca discovers this, she'll have what she needs to finish the work. That's love. Not the comfortable kind that conventional relationships provide, but the fierce kind that requires sacrificing present connection for future possibility. If I'm wrong, if Rebecca never finds this, or finds it too late, or chooses not to continue the work, then I've wasted my final years on futile hope. But if I'm right, if she does finish what I started, then thousands of children will benefit. That possibility justifies the sacrifice. Rebecca closed the journal, tears streaming down her face as they always did, reading Elena's words. Her grandmother had died without knowing she'd been right, without seeing the vindication her work would receive, without understanding that her sacrifice had mattered immeasurably. But Rebecca knew. The twins knew. 38,000 patients knew. And through the Foundation's expanding work, future generations would know that Elena Torres had proven one person's determination could change the world when properly resourced and focused on work that mattered more than comfort. That was the inheritance. That was the treasure. That was the legacy worth more than any dollar amount could measure. Understanding that some problems demand solving regardless of institutional consensus, that patient benefit justifies sacrifices the present can't fully appreciate, and that love's truest expression is working toward futures you'll never see but must build anyway. The Foundation would continue. The research would expand. More treatments would be developed, more lives changed, and more futures created because one woman had refused to quit, and her granddaughter had refused to let her work die with her. In a laboratory that had once been forgotten, but now stood as testament to determination and love, Elena Torres's work continued through the tens of thousands of lives it had already changed, and the countless more it would transform in years ahead. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.